Everyone knows that the Canadian economy has been hit particularly hard by the pandemic, but the Alberta economy has really taken it on the chin. In addition to the pandemic, just a couple of weeks beforehand, Saudi Arabia and Russia got into an oil price war, and of course, you can imagine the how much that affected the Alberta oil and gas companies. So the Business Council of Alberta undertook a survey of CEOs to ask them just how bad things are. To talk with us about that survey is Mike Holden, the Business Council's economist. So welcome to the interview, Mike.
Thank you.
Why don't we start with an overview of that survey, please?
Sure. So what we wanted to do with this survey was take a look at three things specifically. One is what the impact of the COVID-19 and oil price crash crises have been on Alberta businesses up to this point. We wanted to ask them some questions about government support programs and how they were using them, and what their general level of satisfaction and uptake was. And then also we wanted to look further ahead to, the survey took place right about the time where the province was starting to get into this relaunch stage. And so we were looking at what some of the issues they're facing or are worried about, or that would need to be addressed as they move towards long-term economic recovery.
So I gather from the release that I read that the things are pretty dire. About a quarter of the CEOs said they didn't think their company might survive, and that's got to be worrying.
It is, and I mean the interpretation we have of that result is that a quarter of these companies have some concern that they may not make it. So it's not necessarily that 25% are teetering on the brink, but it does mean that 25% of businesses can't say with a solid degree of certainty that yes, we're going to be fine at the end of all of this. And so yeah, that's a concerning finding for sure.
Now, what kind of businesses are we talking about? Are we talking about big oil and gas companies, service companies, mom and pop, hairdressers and pizza shops?
We had a pretty decent range of small, medium, and large businesses. I think that because the Business Council of Alberta is primarily has within its membership large companies and some smaller up and coming businesses, but mostly large, it does skew to the large side of businesses compared to any survey that you get out of the CFIB, for example. So there's a big distinction there. So we had, even if the plurality of businesses in our survey were large, that's still, it's disproportionate compared to how the number of businesses work out across the province. So it's more focused on those, and it's across a whole range of industries. I think we had the largest representation was oil and gas, which I think was in the 35-37% of our respondents range, but the rest were from all over the place.
I would imagine that's got to be concerning to the council and to you as an economist, because it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but if a small 1 or 2 person business fails, that business can be relaunched or there's options. But if you've got larger companies that fail, they're almost like institutions. They take a long time to build, and they have their failure would have bigger consequences for the Alberta economy. Is that a fair comment?
I think so, and it's simply because, if you're talking about one small business versus one large business, absolutely, because that large business employs, by definition of what we count a large business for statistical purposes, is anyone that has more than 500 employees. So that's, if a business like that were to go under, that's a lot of lost jobs, and it's usually more than 500, and of course that'll have spin-off effects through their supply chains, and through other. And elsewhere throughout the economy. And so it is a major concern, but I think that the businesses are, if not optimistic, that they're resilient, and they're looking for ways to get through and to adapt to what the new normal is, whatever that ends up looking like.
Well, let's talk about adaptation and how businesses are getting through, because you surveyed about how businesses felt about the federal support programs. I know there's been a lot of criticism from the oil and gas industry that support has not been approved in a timely fashion. So what did your survey say about policies and support packages?
Well, it showed that we asked a couple of questions about that. The first one was how happy they are on a scale of 1 to 5 with the provincial government response, and the same thing with the federal government response. We found that the support for the province was significantly higher than for the federal government. I think if on that scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is excellent and 1 is very poor, I think around 65% said that they were happy 4 or 5 for the province, only about 34 with the federal government. And there's a couple of issues there. I think one of them is definitely the fact that there's some resistance or some disappointment, I should say, with some of the federal programs, the rent subsidy specifically for smaller businesses, and the LEAF program for larger ones. I don't think that a lot of businesses in the energy sector might have been hoping for some more ambitious support package for them. So that's part of the issue, I think. And the second part of it too is that this is a national crisis. And the expectation is that it requires a national response. And so the federal government has the ability, it has the fiscal firepower to deal with this. And I think that the burden of expectation is probably also higher on the federal government.
This will be the last question, Mike. Are there any policy implications, federally or provincially, that came out of the survey?
Yeah, there are a few. So just for one of them, one of the issues that came up was this loss of employment, and so we had about 61% of businesses said that they had laid off some workers, and one of our follow-up questions found that they weren't all necessarily going to be hiring them back right away. So I think it points to the fact that we got a long path ahead to recovery, that employment is not going to be snapping back. And one of the issues we have to look out for are things like the wage subsidy program. So that's been extended to August. And so what we don't know is how many of the people that are currently on payroll are only on payroll because of the wage subsidy. And once that goes away, it's an open question about how many of those jobs are going to be retained, whether the economy and whether the businesses themselves are in a healthy enough position to retain their staff when they don't have that kind of payroll support.
Mike, thank you very much for this, and we'll be following up with you in the coming months just to see how things are panning out in Alberta. So thank you.
Thank you. Sounds good.